Dawn breaks over the channel, but the horizon does not promise liberation. It promises fire. Men steel themselves in silence as the ramps drop, unaware that history itself hangs in the balance of minutes. What if the greatest gamble of the war, the vast armada assembled to pierce Hitler's fortress, had failed? What if the tide never turned, and the beaches became not the birthplace of freedom, but its graveyard? This is the story hidden in shadows, where victory slips away and the future of the world takes another path. The morning of June 6, 1944, dawned grey and uncertain over the English Channel. In reality, history remembers it as the beginning of liberation, the turning of the tide in Europe. But buried deep within Allied contingency files, the alternative was considered, rehearsed, and feared. What if Operation Neptune, the amphibious component of Operation Overlord, collapsed before the Allies could gain a foothold? In this hidden narrative, Omaha Beach is not remembered as the bloody but won struggle. It is remembered as the place where the liberation of Europe bled to death. The first wave of landing craft struck the shore just after 06:30. In our timeline, many were cut down, yet enough men clawed through the firestorm to keep hope alive. In this alternate account, the German 352nd Infantry Division, better prepared and reinforced than Allied planners ever imagined, unleashed a killing field from the bluffs. Pre-sighted artillery zeroed in on the boats before ramps even lowered. Men of the 116th Infantry Regiment and the 1st Division were trapped, drowning under gear or torn apart before their boots touched sand. Engineers carrying demolition charges never reached the obstacles. The tide rolled back over bodies tangled in barbed wire and Czech hedgehogs. Naval gunfire support, meant to soften the defenses, had lifted too soon, leaving the German strongpoints intact. By WWII, Omaha was a graveyard. The situation spiraled beyond control. Radio operators screamed for reinforcements, but the second wave fared no better. LSTs disgorged tanks, only to see them founder in the surf or erupt in flames under anti-tank fire. Eisenhower's Great Crusade teetered on collapse within the first hours. General Omar Bradley, overseeing from the cruiser USS Augusta, weighed the unthinkable: withdrawal. "We are killing our men," one aide recorded in a private note later buried in archives. By noon, Bradley recommended halting further landings at Omaha altogether, shifting resources toward Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. But the contagion of failure spread. Utah, lightly defended in reality, now faced unexpected counterattacks from the 709th Division, redirected once German intelligence confirmed Omaha's destruction. Canadian and British forces fought desperately inland, but without American pressure anchoring the western flank, they too risked isolation. Hitler, roused, in Berchtesgaden hours later than he should have been, was briefed on what he called a second Dunkirk. Unlike in real history, the failure at Omaha was total, and Hitler gave permission for armored reserves to move without delay. By the evening of June 6th, Panzer Lehr Division and elements of the 21st Panzer Division were already rolling toward the coast. Air supremacy, the Allies' greatest weapon, was suddenly irrelevant as tanks drove into bottlenecked beaches. Rommel's Atlantic Wall, ridiculed in retrospect, had held long enough to give the Reich a second breath. For the Allies, the consequences were catastrophic. Eisenhower had prepared a statement, accepting responsibility for failure should the invasion falter, but in this timeline, the document was not filed away as a curiosity. It was broadcast. His resignation was quietly tendered days later, with George Marshall pressed to step forward in a war already fraying under the weight of defeat. Across the Atlantic, President Roosevelt faced questions about American boys dying on foreign sands, with nothing to show but body counts. Isolationist voices, silenced since Pearl Harbor, resurfaced with brutal force. Another Gallipoli, the Chicago Tribune declared. Churchill, shaken but defiant, urged continued operations. Yet whispers in Parliament grew louder. Britain's resources were drained, its people exhausted. Without a foothold in France, the Western democracies risked losing not just the war, but the political resolve to continue. Meanwhile, in the East, Stalin watched with a mixture of vindication and fury. The Soviet leader had long accused the Western allies of delay, of letting Russia bleed while they bided their time. Now, with D-Day a ruin, the Red Army bore the full weight of the war against Germany. Operation Bagration, launched later that June, achieved immense successes, obliterating Army Group Center and driving toward Warsaw. But the Soviets no longer expected meaningful relief from the West. Stalin calculated accordingly. If the Allies could not break into Fortress Europe, then the Soviet Union would carry the war into Germany alone and claim the spoils. The summer of 1944 became a season of recalculation. The Allies fell back on Mediterranean plans, discussing a renewed push through Italy and the Balkans. But the German army, buoyed by its unexpected triumph in Normandy, reinforced its defenses with captured material and redeployed divisions from the west to counter the Soviets. The war dragged on into 1946, longer and bloodier. When at last, Berlin fell, it was not to a handshake between Soviet and American troops on the Elbe, but to Soviet banners rising over the entire city, uncontested. The Western Allies entered Germany only months later, their lines of occupation negotiated not by triumph, but by Stalin's dictates. The political aftermath was seismic. France remained under German control until the very end, suffering years of additional occupation. The French resistance, starved of Allied aid, faced merciless reprisals. Thousands perished in reprisals never carried out in our timeline. Charles de Gaulle, exiled and bitter, warned that France might never recover its sovereignty, not with Soviet divisions now sitting on the Rhine. For Britain, the consequences were existential. Churchill's government fractured under the weight of defeat, and by the time Germany finally collapsed, Britain's global position was irretrievably weakened. The United States, though still a superpower, faced a Cold War starting not in the rubble of Berlin, but in the shadow of Soviet hegemony over nearly all of continental Europe. Eastern and Central Europe were not merely satellite states. They were integrated into the Soviet sphere by conquest and occupation, leaving only Britain and a hesitant United States standing in opposition. In the muted voices of survivors and in the secret memoranda of generals, the failed D-Day invasion was remembered as the day the Allies lost the chance to shape Europe's future. The beaches of Normandy became a symbol not of liberation, but of miscalculation, a testament to how history can pivot on hours of blood and fire. In the end, Operation Neptune was not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning, the point at which the Western dream of liberating Europe drowned in the tide and the guns of the Atlantic Wall. For decades afterward, historians spoke cautiously of what might have been, but classified reports told the story plainly. Had the beaches held, the world would have belonged to the Allies, but because they failed, the world belonged to the Soviets. In the carefully orchestrated deception campaign of 1944, Operation Fortitude South was designed to convince the Germans that the real Allied invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, and the phantom 1st US Army Group under General George Patton painted a picture of overwhelming force poised to strike the Channel's narrowest crossing. In reality, it was an elaborate mirage. But when the Normandy landings collapsed in blood and failure, the Allies were forced to look back at the illusion they had created. What began as the most audacious bluff in military history suddenly became their only option for salvation. The decision to reorient toward Calais was not taken lightly. In the aftermath of Omaha's annihilation and the near collapse of Utah, Eisenhower's staff found themselves in a crisis room where desperation replaced optimism. Montgomery argued for regrouping and launching another strike before German reinforcements could fully entrench. Patton, sidelined in the deception role, now emerged as the only general with a ready-made army, even if most of his equipment was canvas and plywood. The irony was bitter. The Allies had no choice but to transform their ghost army into a flesh-and-blood force. Pas-de-Calais, once dismissed as too heavily fortified, became the new target of invasion planning. German high command, for once, was caught between paranoia and clarity. After Normandy's repulse, Hitler's generals expected the Allies to strike again, but they debated where. Intelligence reports from Abwehr and intercepted signals still pointed to Calais. But many believed the Allies would never risk the strongest point of the Atlantic Wall. The Luftwaffe, weakened though it was, redoubled reconnaissance flights, spotting new Allied buildups along the Dover coast. Hitler, ever convinced of his own infallibility, declared that Calais had always been the true invasion point. His directive to strengthen the Pas-de-Calais sector only reinforced what the Allies already feared. They were about to throw men against the most fortified stretch of coastline in Europe. The invasion came months later than Overlord had originally intended. Weather delays, logistical nightmares, and political debates stretched into late August. The beaches of Calais, Sangatte, Vissant, Cap Blanc-Nez, were bristling with concrete bunkers, 88-meter guns and minefields layered thicker than anywhere in France. Rommel's engineers had laid fresh obstacles in anticipation of just such a landing. When the first wave of Allied troops finally surged ashore, they faced a wall of steel, unlike anything encountered at Normandy. Naval bombardment shook the coastline for hours beforehand, but German casemates built into the chalk cliffs endured, spitting fire back into the surf. The assault resembled Gallipoli more than Normandy. Slow, grinding, catastrophic. The casualty lists were staggering, yet unlike at Omaha, the Allies did not immediately break. Determined to avoid another humiliation, Eisenhower and Montgomery committed reserve after reserve, pouring divisions into the breach. Airborne troops dropped inland to cut off reinforcements, but many were slaughtered in the fields and villages north of Calais. The French resistance, weakened after months of German crackdowns, struggled to mount meaningful support. Still, by sheer weight of numbers and Allied naval supremacy, small lodgements were carved out. The cost was unsustainable, yet retreat was unthinkable. The Allies bled their way forward. The strategic consequences, however, were dire. Every day spent fighting at Calais delayed the liberation of France. Paris, which in our timeline was freed by August 1944, remained under German control until well into 1945. Resistance fighters were left to face reprisals without aid, and the French population grew resentful of the Allies' apparent inability to deliver on their promises of liberation. Politically, this delay shook the alliance to its core. Churchill, under fire at home, was forced to defend a war plan that seemed to repeat the disasters of World War I. Roosevelt's administration, facing an election year, grappled with mounting American casualties for a war effort that looked increasingly mired. The Soviet Union, watching from the east, saw vindication of its long-held suspicion. The West was incapable of striking decisively. For Germany, Calais offered a reprieve. Though the Reich was crumbling under the Red Army's advance in the east, the survival of France under German occupation bought Hitler critical time. Factories continued to feed the Wehrmacht. WWII rockets rained down on London longer than in reality, their launch sites unmolested for months. German morale, buoyed by the victory at Normandy and the brutal resistance at Calais, stiffened. Propaganda trumpeted that the Allies had chosen the strongest point of the Atlantic Wall and broken themselves upon it. Even as the Reich's Eastern Front collapsed, the Western defense delayed the inevitable. By spring of 1945, the Allies had at last clawed their way off the Calais beaches and begun pushing inland, but the price was steep. Nearly a year had been lost, and with it, the opportunity to liberate Eastern Europe. The Red Army's unstoppable advance surged far beyond Berlin. By the time American and British troops finally broke through into northern France, Soviet divisions were already sweeping across Austria, Hungary, and into Bavaria. The envisioned meeting on the Elbe River became instead a unilateral Soviet occupation of vast swathes of Europe. The post-war order shifted with brutal clarity. France, liberated late and broken by years of continued German control, found itself a diminished partner in Allied councils. Britain, battered by rocket attacks and economic exhaustion, staggered toward decline. The United States, though still powerful, faced a Europe already dominated by Stalin's forces. Germany was carved not into 4 occupation zones, but effectively into 2. A Soviet-controlled east extending almost to the Rhine, and a small western enclave left to Britain and America. The Cold War began not as a tense standoff in Berlin, but as a humiliating retreat from the continent the West had failed to liberate in time. Historians later called the second invasion Overlord's Ghost. It was the operation that was never meant to happen, yet which dictated the shape of the modern world. Classified British memoranda noted bitterly that we succeeded in proving the deception so well that we deceived ourselves. In the silence of archives and the memories of the men who survived the beaches of Calais, the truth was undeniable. When Normandy fell, the decoy became destiny. The price of that irony was not only paid in blood on the sand, but in the shadow it cast over an entire century. In the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, German commanders along the Normandy coast awoke to a storm unlike any they had imagined. The invasion was real, the Allies had come, and the beaches of France erupted in fire. In our history, hesitation from Hitler's headquarters and confusion within the chain of command allowed the Allies to consolidate their fragile positions. But deep within Wehrmacht planning files, another possibility existed. What if Rommel's counterattack had been unleashed within hours, before the Allies could entrench, before naval and air superiority could crush German movement? In this hidden version, Rommel's counterstroke came not days later, but at dawn. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, had argued for months that the only way to defeat an Allied landing was to strike it immediately, to drive the invaders into the sea before they could build momentum. The first 24 hours, he insisted, will decide the fate of Europe. In this alternate timeline, Rommel's warnings are heeded. Panzer Division, 12th SS Panzer, Hitlerjugend, and elements of the 21st Panzer Division are not held in reserve awaiting Hitler's personal release, but instead move under Rommel's direct authority the moment word arrives that Allied troops are on the beaches. At 07 WWII, while Allied landing craft are still disgorging blooded infantry into withering fire, the thunder of treads echoes across Normandy's bocage. German armoured columns surge toward the beaches, cutting through villages and hedgerows. Allied air patrols, stretched thin by poor weather and the vast scope of the invasion, struggle to spot and interdict them. By mid-morning, Panzer spearheads crash into British lines near Sword Beach, shattering fragile airborne units scattered during their night drops. At Juno and Gold, Canadian and British troops, still fighting through beach obstacles, find themselves caught between the sea and advancing armour. At Omaha, where American forces cling desperately to sand dunes under murderous fire, the sight of German tanks cresting the bluffs breaks morale. Bradley's headquarters aboard USS Augusta receives frantic reports. They are on top of us, armour in strength, we cannot hold. Naval gunfire opens up in desperation, hammering inland routes. But the panzers are already among the infantry. German commanders exploit every weakness. Communications cut, beachheads fragmented, reinforcements bottlenecked in the channel. Rommel's doctrine, hit fast, annihilate quickly, begins to unfold in terrifying clarity. By the end of June 6th, Sword and Juno are overrun, Omaha has collapsed into evacuation, and Utah is isolated. Tens of thousands of Allied troops surrender, their positions untenable against encircling armor. The invasion, hailed only hours earlier as the turning of the tide, becomes a massacre. The short-term consequences are devastating. Eisenhower's command, shaken to its core, convenes an emergency council aboard HMS Belfast. Evacuation of surviving forces becomes the only option. Naval destroyers run into the surf to rescue men as Luftwaffe sorties, rare in our history, now find targets in retreat. By June 7th, the last beachheads are abandoned. Overlord is finished. In London, Churchill delivers a grim address, invoking Dunkirk, while knowing in his heart there would be no miracle of deliverance this time. Across the Atlantic, American newspapers scream headlines of disaster. Roosevelt faces an election year, crippled by defeat, his critics calling for a reassessment of Europe First strategy. For Germany, the victory is intoxicating. Propaganda proclaims the invasion crushed in its cradle. Hitler, elated, rewards Rommel with public accolades and renewed authority. Yet the triumph is not absolute. The Reich remains battered in the east, where Stalin's armies continue their summer offensive. Still, the collapse of D-Day shifts the strategic balance. German divisions that would have been tied down in France are now redeployed eastward. The Red Army, though advancing, meets stiffer resistance in Poland and East Prussia. The war in the east drags on longer, bloodier, with Soviet casualties mounting even higher. The political ripples reshape the post-war world. With no foothold, in France, the Western Allies are forced back to the Mediterranean. Operation Dragoon, the planned invasion of southern France, is abandoned in favor of shoring up Italy and the Balkans. Plans for a cross-channel invasion are shelved indefinitely. Britain, battered and exhausted, begins to falter in resolve. In Washington, isolationist voices return with force, demanding an end to Roosevelt's European folly and greater focus on Japan. American reinforcements are redirected to the Pacific, accelerating the island-hopping campaign, but leaving Europe in limbo. The Western alliance strains under doubt. For Stalin, the consequences are both opportunity and burden. With the West stalled, the Soviet Union becomes the sole hammer striking Nazi Germany. The Red Army pushes relentlessly, its sacrifices unmatched, its victories undeniable. By 1946, Soviet banners fly not just over Berlin, but deep into Central Europe, unchecked by Anglo-American presence. Austria, Czechoslovakia, and even parts of northern Italy fall within Moscow's orbit. When Germany finally collapses, it is not to the handshake of allies meeting on the Elbe, but to Soviet domination across the continent. The Cold War, in this alternate reality, begins in a vastly different landscape. France, occupied until the very end and humiliated by Allied failure, emerges weak and divided, fertile ground for communist influence. Britain, stripped of prestige and empire, clings desperately to American support. The United States, still powerful, faces a Europe already lost to Soviet hegemony. Churchill's dream of a free Western Europe is buried on the beaches of Normandy, replaced by Stalin's vision of a continent remade under the Red Banner. Historians examining the Rommel plan in later decades would conclude that its success hinged not on German strength, but on Allied vulnerability. The first hours of the invasion were always precarious. Had armor moved swiftly enough, had Hitler released his reserves without hesitation, the outcome could have mirrored this nightmare. Rommel's counterstroke at dawn in this alternate history did not merely repel an invasion. It altered the trajectory of the 20th century. The Western Allies, broken in Normandy, surrendered their claim to shape Europe's destiny. The continent, instead, was hammered into a new order by Soviet tanks, while the beaches of France remained forever stained as the place where liberation drowned in the tide. In June 1944, Britain stood at the edge of exhaustion. The country had endured 5 years of war, the Blitz, rationing, and the slow bleed of empire. D-Day was meant to be the moment of redemption, the day Churchill's words, "We shall never surrender," would at last bear fruit in the liberation of Europe. But in this alternate history, where the Normandy landings failed, the optimism of June 6th turned to despair by June 7th. And in Whitehall, behind closed doors, whispers began to circulate. Could Winston Churchill himself be sacrificed for the survival of the nation? The news from France was devastating. Omaha annihilated, Sword and Juneau crushed under German armor, Utah cut off and retreating. By June 10th, Allied forces had been forced back into the Channel, leaving behind tens of thousands of dead, captured or missing. Eisenhower's resignation was transmitted discreetly to Washington. Bradley's reputation was shattered. Montgomery's credibility in Britain evaporated. Yet the gravest shock was political. The public, buoyed by promises of imminent liberation, now faced another disaster on the scale of Dunkirk, but this time without the triumph of escape. Churchill's speeches, once fire to the soul, now struck many as hollow. "We have fed our sons into the furnace," one member of Parliament wrote privately, "and the Prime Minister tells us to take heart from the flames." Inside Parliament, the knives came out. Critics of Churchill, long muted by his wartime aura, found their voices. Conservative backbenchers whispered of Anthony Eden as a steadier hand. Others pointed to Viscount Halifax, once dismissed for his appeasement leanings, as a man who might negotiate a settlement to spare Britain further ruin. On the Labour benches, Clement Attlee remained outwardly loyal, but some within the party began to wonder if Churchill's gamble had cost Britain too much. For the first time since 1940, the War Cabinet itself split into factions. Classified memoranda reveal that a private meeting was held on June 14th, where the possibility of a vote of no confidence was discussed, an unthinkable act at the height of war, yet one that gathered momentum with each day of silence from the beaches. In Washington, the crisis was no less severe. Roosevelt's administration, already reeling from the invasion's collapse, received cables warning of instability in London. Confidence in Churchill waning, one report noted. Possibility of leadership change imminent. American diplomats urged caution, but the political cost of continued reliance on Churchill grew steeper with each casualty list published in American newspapers. Privately, some in Roosevelt's circle believed a new British leader might be easier to deal with, less domineering, more willing to defer to American priorities. The Anglo-American alliance, the bedrock of the war effort, strained under suspicion. Churchill himself, usually unshakable, was described in private accounts as gaunt and sleepless, smoking endlessly, pacing the halls of Downing Street. His confidant, Lord Moran, wrote of a man haunted by his own shadow, aware that the tide of fortune had at last turned against him. Churchill still thundered in speeches, insisting Britain would fight on, but in the corridors of power, men who once stood behind him now waited for the moment to move. The coup did not come as a military putsch or a sudden overthrow, but as a parliamentary maneuver cloaked in procedure. On June 22nd, a motion of no confidence was introduced, framed not as a condemnation of Churchill personally, but as a call for new leadership to direct the war. The debate was fierce, but the failure of Normandy hung over every word. Churchill defended himself with characteristic vigor, invoking the sacrifices of the fallen, warning that defeatism would deliver Europe to tyranny. Yet his magic was gone. The vote passed by a narrow margin. Within days, Churchill tendered his resignation to the king, and a new government was formed. Viscount Halifax, the Foreign Secretary turned reluctant Prime Minister, assumed office on July 1st. His first priority was to stabilize Britain's war effort, but his instincts leaned toward negotiation. Halifax sought to open back channels through neutral Sweden and Switzerland, probing for a possible settlement with Germany that might preserve Britain's independence while conceding Germany dominance on the continent. These efforts, never fully realized, sowed deep distrust in Washington and fury in Moscow. Stalin, already convinced that the West had betrayed the Soviet Union, now regarded Britain as a wavering ally at best, a potential collaborator at worst. The British public was divided. Some, weary of war and crushed by the invasion's failure, welcomed the idea of a settlement. Others felt betrayed, their sacrifices squandered. Churchill, now out of office, became a symbol of resistance in exile, delivering defiant speeches to cheering crowds but powerless to alter events. The coup in London, as it came to be known, fractured Britain's national spirit. Where once there had been unity of purpose, now there was uncertainty, doubt, and division. The long-term consequences were profound. With Britain hesitant and America distracted by the Pacific, the Soviet Union pressed forward alone in Europe. By 1946, Stalin's armies occupied not only Eastern Europe, but much of Western Europe as well. France, Belgium, and the Netherlands were liberated not by Anglo-American troops, but by Soviet tanks. The balance of power at the war's end tilted entirely toward Moscow, and the Cold War began not as a bipolar contest, but as a lopsided standoff. The Iron Curtain was not a line across Germany. It was the western coastline of Europe itself. Historians would later argue whether Churchill's removal was inevitable, or whether his presence might have held Britain to its course. Some suggest that even had he remained, the strategic realities after Normandy's failure left little hope. Yet the symbolism of the coup was undeniable. The man who had vowed never to surrender, who had personified resistance in 1940, was cast aside by his own parliament in 1944. For those who survived the war, it was a wound as deep as any battlefield loss. Classified papers reveal the bitterness of American officials who described Britain as a broken ally, and the fury of Soviet envoys who mocked the West as incapable of history's burdens. The coup in London marked not just the end of Churchill's wartime leadership, but the end of Britain's role as a decisive power in the shaping of the modern world. In the quiet aftermath, as Halifax sought compromise and Churchill faded into opposition, the fate of Europe was sealed. The beaches of Normandy had determined the military outcome. Westminster's chambers had decided the political one. The war continued, but the world that followed belonged no longer to Britain, nor to the dream of shared victory. It belonged to those who had seized history's moment while others faltered. When Operation Overlord collapsed in June 1944, the immediate consequences were measured in bodies on the beaches and headlines of despair in London and Washington. But in Moscow, the meaning was far deeper. For years, Stalin had accused his Western allies of delay, of letting the Red Army bleed while they prepared for their own hour of glory. Now, with the invasion a ruin and no second front in sight, Stalin faced both vindication and opportunity. The Soviet gamble, already in motion with Operation Bagration, suddenly transformed from one thrust in a coalition war to the decisive campaign of total conquest. Operation Bagration began on June 22, 1944, the third anniversary of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. In our history, it destroyed Army Group Center and opened the road to Warsaw. In this alternate reality, its objectives expanded. Soviet Stavka directives, unearthed decades later in archives, reveal contingency, plans to push not only to the Vistula but beyond, exploiting the vacuum left by Allied failure. If the West could not breach the Atlantic Wall, the Red Army would carry the war across the continent, unopposed. The results were staggering. By August 1944, Minsk, Vilnius, and Lublin had fallen. German forces reeled backward, but unlike in our timeline, reinforcements were available from the West. Divisions unneeded in France were rushed east, stiffening the Wehrmacht's defense. Yet the Soviets, fueled by rage, manpower, and overwhelming artillery, crushed each counterattack with relentless force. The summer became a cauldron of annihilation. Soviet tank armies stormed through Poland, while partisan uprisings, like the doomed Warsaw Revolt, erupted prematurely, desperate for liberation. But there would be no timely Western aid, no Allied bombers dropping supplies. Soviet commanders, determined to let no independent resistance take root, watched as the Germans crushed the Warsaw Uprising, only moving in when the city was already ash and ruin. It was not liberation, it was conquest by fire. As autumn turned to winter, the Red Army surged into East Prussia and Hungary, smashing through lines once thought impregnable. Stalin's calculus was simple. The farther the Soviets advanced, the stronger their claim at war's end. At Yalta, in this alternate future, the negotiations were not a bargaining table among equals, but a Soviet dictate. Churchill, already toppled in London, and Roosevelt, weakened at home, were left with little leverage. American divisions remained, bottled up in the Mediterranean or redirected to the Pacific. Britain, bled white and politically divided, could offer no counterweight. Stalin alone dictated the shape of Europe's post-war order. By early 1946, Soviet forces had reached the Rhine. France, Belgium, and the Netherlands were liberated not by Anglo-American armies, but by Soviet tank brigades. Paris fell in February 1946 to the First Belarusian Front under Marshal Zhukov, who staged a victory parade under the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. French resistance fighters cheered, but soon realized they had traded one occupier for another. Communist parties, backed by Moscow, seized power across the continent. In Italy, the Red Army's presence north of the Po River ensured the rise of communist influence. In Greece, the civil war tilted irrevocably toward Moscow's proxies. By the time Germany collapsed in May 1946, nearly the entire continent lay within Stalin's grip. The United States, victorious in the Pacific after atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, turned belatedly to Europe, only to find it already lost. American generals warned that a direct confrontation with the Soviets would mean a Third World War before the Second had even ended. Roosevelt, his health failing, sought compromise. His successor, Harry Truman, inherited a world where the Iron Curtain did not divide Berlin, but stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to the Aegean Sea. The Cold War began not as a contest of influence, but as a desperate effort to contain Soviet domination of nearly all of Europe. The long-term consequences reshaped the century. NATO was never born. Instead, the United States turned inward, focusing on hemispheric defense and Asian security. Britain, stripped of empire and leadership, accepted a role as a diminished island power under the shadow of Soviet continental dominance. France, occupied twice in less than a decade, succumbed to communist rule, its politics remade by Moscow. Germany, partitioned entirely under Soviet occupation, ceased to exist as a Western ally. The map of Europe was painted red. The Soviet gamble had paid off beyond Stalin's wildest expectations. What had begun as a desperate struggle for survival in 1941 ended with the Soviet Union standing astride Europe in 1946, its power unrivaled, its ideology ascendant. For the peoples of Eastern and Western Europe, the cost was decades of repression, secret police, and the silencing of dissent. Classified American intelligence reports written in the late 1940s speak of an entire continent locked behind a wall of steel and silence. The Western dream of liberating Europe had drowned on the shores of Normandy, and in its place rose a Soviet century. Yet victory carried its own seeds of fragility. Soviet overextension, economic strain, and resistance movements simmering beneath. The surface would eventually test the empire Stalin had built. But for the moment, the world was his. The gamble had succeeded, reshaping history's balance. The failed D-Day invasion, remembered in hushed tones and classified files, was not merely a lost battle. It was the hinge on which the entire fate of Europe swung. And in the silence of Normandy's beaches, the echoes of that failure reverberated across generations, a reminder that the destiny of nations can be decided in a single day by choices made or not made before dawn. The waves still crash on Normandy's shores, washing over quiet sands that once bore the weight of destiny. In another telling, those sands swallowed freedom whole, leaving only silence where hope once landed. The world we know might have been unrecognizable, its borders redrawn in iron, its peoples bound by fear, its future dictated not by liberation, but by conquest. History remembers triumph, but in the dark corners of forgotten files lies the reminder that victory was never inevitable. One day, one invasion could have ended it all differently,